And on this day 57 years ago, more than 200,000 people gathered on the National Mall for the March on Washington, led by civil rights leaders, including Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. The massive crowd gathered to fight for freedom and jobs. They also aimed to draw attention to the inequalities faced by African Americans, which King famously highlighted in his I Have a Dream speech. Now, nearly 6 decades later, another march is taking place, this one organized by the Reverend Al Sharpton and the National Action Network. And in this march, tens of thousands of people are marching for criminal justice reform in Washington, D.C. It is called the Commitment March, Get Your Knee Off Our Necks. The event organized after the death of George Floyd. Those attending are hoping to inspire change.
We need change, and last time they had the march, something came out of it. So we're going to see what we can do this weekend.
And today's event includes a prayer service, a rally, and a march to the MLK Jr. Memorial.
Now let's get out to a live look to our nation's capital, where the event is happening right now. There are going to be several speakers today, including the families of those who have lost their lives at the hands of police. We know family members of George Floyd, Trayvon Martin, Eric Garner, Ahmaud Arbery, and Breonna Taylor are expected to address the crowd throughout the day. And joining us now to talk more about the significance of this march, Roy Tatum, who is the president of the East Valley NAACP. Good morning, Roy, and thank you for joining us. I want to ask you, how significant are these events happening today in D.C. when you really do think about the March on Washington 57 years ago?
Well, the call for the March on Washington in 1963 was centered around jobs and justice. And in 2020, we see the same call and the relevant call for justice in particular, but equality all around. And we've seen so many senseless murders, senseless deaths, senseless violence at the hands of police officers against Black men, women, and children. And we've got to address this issue, not just on a local level, but on a national level, because the violence has just become unbearable. And when we see what happened with Jacob Blake in Kenosha, Wisconsin, just this week, shot 7 times point blank in the back, in front of his children. And from George Floyd, the knee on the neck, Ahmaud Arbery, we've seen him violently killed, Breonna Taylor killed in her home. And so we've got to address this violence against our community at the hands of the police and at the hands of vigilantes. I mean, when we talk about the young gentleman that, or the young terrorists, I would say, that shot the protesters point blank in Kenosha as well.
So Reverend Al Sharpton is calling on the Senate to pass the George Floyd Justice and Policing Act, which would end certain police practices like no-knock warrants and chokeholds. How critical do you think this legislation is for local communities as well?
It's absolutely critical, because we need some federal oversight on police behavior and the over-policing within the community. And so I know Representative Greg Stanton and Representative Ruben Gallego and Raul Grijalva as well, a number of our democratically elected congressional delegation in Arizona support this legislation as well. I will say I was actually with Representative Ruben Gallego when it was initially being discussed. And so I'm definitely in support of this level of legislation being passed and proposed.
So we keep seeing these marches across the country, the most recent one now for Jacob Blake. Do you think that this is actually resonating with our public officials at all?
It has to. It has to, because I believe now with every incident of police violence and murder, you will see a reaction from the community. These behaviors will no longer be swept under the rug, and people are not going to be quiet about it.
They're not being swept under the rug, but they keep happening. This latest incident with Jacob Blake, 7 times in the back. I mean, do you really think that comes down to training?
I don't know what police department trains to do that in that type of situation. I will say I've worked with a number of police departments in the Valley, and no one suggests that police officers, one, if he's under investigation, he should not have been allowed to even walk back to his vehicle. He should have been detained. He should have been detained probably on the sidewalk. And I'm not a police officer, but I'm just saying common sense would tell you there's some common sense policing there. If this young man was under investigation, there's no way that police officer or those police officers, there were multiple officers on the scene, should have allowed Mr. Blake to even go back to his car. And that would have probably prevented the 7 shots in the back. So training is important, but I don't know what kind of training they were operating under.
So today also marks the 65th anniversary of the lynching of 14-year-old Emmett Till. In some ways, African Americans and people of color, they're still living in fear for their lives. So what do you think needs to be done for our society to actually change for the better?
We've got to have open, honest dialogue. We've got to understand the realities in America. We've got to understand the realities that Black Americans have had to face and endure. I remember learning about Emmett Till myself as a young boy, about 7 or 8 years old, probably as a tale or a story of how to conduct yourself in the South when you're around white people. Many young Black men and Black children have had to learn some of these stories because, unfortunately, just being a child could put our lives in jeopardy.
Let's talk about voting. The election, of course, is coming up. We're hearing all of these campaign ads. They just keep flooding the airways. How important do you think this election is going to be to actually making that change?
This election is critical. When we see some of the attacks on free speech, the attacks on the rights to assembly, when you see the president deploying militaristic forces against peaceful protesters. I don't know how many times people have been to the White House, but there's always some type of protest outside of the White House. We've never seen those people disperse with force like we saw the president use. And when we also see him attacking the post office is a constitutional institution. And so to attack the post office means that you're willing to attack the Constitution.
All right. Roy Tatum with the NAACP out in the East Valley. Thank you so much for joining us. It's always good to chat with you, sir. Hope you have a good I hope you have a good rest of the morning. Mark?
You as well. Take care.